What if I told you the British Crown's most polished portraits sometimes hide fingerprints on knives, on forged papers, on vanished witnesses, on entire peoples written out of their own land? What if the grand pageantry, the crowns and choirs and velvet-lined carriages occasionally served as a curtain you could draw across a crime scene and call it history, because royal history isn't only wars and weddings, it's also cover-ups, coerced confessions, suspicious deaths, stolen fortunes, and the quiet administrative violence of a signature. In this documentary, we're walking through 50 of the most twisted crimes and criminal scandals tangled up with Britain's monarchy, some proven, some strongly suspected, some still disputed, all revealing something uncomfortable about power. If you like long, calm, fact-dense stories you can listen to in the background, tap like, subscribe, and settle in. Tonight we're not chasing gossip, we're following the paper trail, the bodies, and the silence. Crime 1. William the Conqueror's harrying of the North. In the winter of 1069 to 1070, northern England learned what it meant to resist a new king. William the Fee faced rebellions and Danish-supported uprisings. The usual medieval response would be punitive raids and executions. Instead, contemporary chroniclers describe something closer to organized devastation. Villages burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered, and whole districts reduced to famine conditions. Later records, like the Domesday Book compiled in 1086, show large areas in the north listed as waste, a chilling little word that reads like bureaucracy but smells like smoke. This wasn't a crime in the modern courtroom sense. No medieval jury indicted a conquering monarch for mass starvation, but by any modern definition, it's collective punishment on a huge scale, aimed not at armed rebels alone, but at the civilian base that could feed them. The pivot is the intent, not just winning battles, but breaking a region's capacity to recover. And speaking of how a crown can punish without needing a trial, sometimes the most twisted royal crimes aren't secret murders, they're public policy. Crime 2, Henry II and the blood around Thomas Becket, December 29th, 1170. 4 knights enter Canterbury Cathedral. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, is inside. By the end of the confrontation, Becket is dead, struck down in a sacred space, his blood spreading across the stone. The question that haunts this case is not whether Becket was killed, it's how. Henry II had been locked in a power struggle with Becket over church authority and royal control. Contemporary accounts report Henry erupting in rage, allegedly uttering some version of the infamous complaint, words that, even if imperfectly quoted, were heard as a royal wish. Knights close to the king interpreted that fury as a green light. They went to Canterbury, confronted Becket, and killed him. The legal trickiness is obvious. Did Henry order the assassination? We don't have a signed command, but we do have motive, public conflict, and the pattern of medieval courts where powerful men rarely wrote down the dirtiest instruction. Henry later performed public penance, which reads like a political necessity and an admission that the world believed royal culpability was real. Meanwhile, the church turned Becket into a martyr, and Henry's authority into something that looked dangerously unaccountable. Crime 3, King John's disappearing prisoners. King John's reign, 1199 to 1216, is a catalogue of grievances, so much so that it helped push England toward Magna Carta in 1215. But among the more chilling threads are the stories of high-status prisoners who entered royal custody and did not come out again. Arthur of Brittany, John's young nephew, had a strong claim to the throne. Arthur was captured in 1202 and held under John's control. By 1203 he vanished from the record, with later rumours claiming John personally killed him or arranged the killing. The evidence is not a neat modern case file. It's a patchwork of contemporary suspicion and political consequence, yet the suspicion mattered because it fit John's pattern. Ruthless, paranoid, and willing to use imprisonment as a tool of obliteration rather than containment. There are also accounts, again disputed in details, of other prisoners allegedly starved or mistreated to death. including nobles who became inconvenient. A medieval king didn't need a courtroom when the cell door was his. And speaking of cell doors, there's a particular kind of cruelty that looks quiet until you notice it is systematic. Crime 4. Edward I and the expulsion of England's Jews. In 1290, Edward I issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering Jews to leave England. It's often presented as a single event, a decree, a line in a textbook. But as a royal crime, it's more accurate to see it as the end of a long process of squeezing a minority for money and then ejecting them when it became politically profitable. Medieval English monarchs had treated Jewish communities as a kind of taxable property, extracting funds through levies, seizures, and forced payments. Anti-Jewish violence and blood libels circulated. Economic resentments were weaponized. When Edward moved to expel Jews, the crown also benefited from confiscations and cancelled obligations. Debts owed to Jews could become a convenient fog of paperwork. This wasn't a hidden scandal. It was state action dressed as moral and social order. By modern standards, it's an act of religious persecution and forced displacement, enabled by a monarch's authority and reinforced by law. The consequences stretched for centuries. Jews were formally barred from England until the mid-17th century. The cruelty here is not only what was done, but how normal it was made to seem, like the realm tidying itself up. Crime 5. Edward II, favourites and the politics of blackmail. Edward II, reign 1307 to 1327, is often remembered for military failure and personal turmoil, but the royal crime angle shows up in how favouritism and patronage could warp the machinery of justice. The king's intense relationships with favourites, most famously Piers Gaveston and later the Despensers, created a court environment where access to the monarch became currency. Nobles who opposed the favourites found themselves punished, dispossessed or forced into submission. The Despensers in particular were widely accused by contemporaries of land grabbing and using royal influence to extort property through legal pressure and intimidation. It's not that medieval magnates were innocent lambs. It's that under Edward II, the sense that the law had become a tool of a clique helped push the kingdom toward violent political rupture. When Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer overthrew Edward in 1327, the rhetoric was soaked in accusations of misrule, an early example of political legitimacy being argued through the language of wrongdoing. And speaking of overthrows, royal history has a grim habit of solving disputes by making people disappear in ways that are very convenient for whoever ends up wearing the crown. Crime 6. The death of Edward II. In captivity. After Edward II was deposed, he was held as a prisoner. In September 1327, he died. The official line was vague. Rumours were not. Later accounts, especially those written after the fact, included the infamous tale of a grotesque murder method designed to leave no visible mark. The problem is that this story is not securely documented in the immediate contemporary record. It may be propaganda, sensationalism, or a lurid invention that stuck because it suited the mood. Still, even if the method is doubtful, the core suspicion remains historically serious. Did Edward II die naturally, or was he killed on orders from the regime that replaced him? In a world where a living ex-king could become a rallying point for rebellion, the incentive is obvious. A dead Edward is a sealed chapter. A living Edward is a loose thread someone might pull. The twist is that royal politics often treated murder as a form of administrative tidying, removing a risk. Whether Edward was assassinated or died from harsh confinement, the moral stain is similar. Custody became the place where inconvenient legitimacy went to end. Crime 7. Richard II and the weaponization of treason. Richard II, reigned 1377-1399, didn't need to personally swing an axe to make the law lethal. During his reign, political conflict sharpened around accusations of treason. Parliament and royal councils became arenas where enemies could be legally transformed into traitors, an alchemy that turned political opposition into a death sentence and asset seizure. The royal power to declare, prosecute and punish treason, made the crown both referee and player. Richard's later years saw a tightening circle of loyalists and a harsh approach toward those who challenged royal authority. When Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile and ultimately deposed Richard to become Henry IV, Richard ended up in prison. He died in captivity in 1400, likely at Pontefract Castle. Some sources suggest starvation, others imply murder. As with other royal deaths in custody, the record is murky, but the political logic is brutally clear. This is the crime that hides inside procedure. Treason law, used aggressively, could be less about national security and more about power security. And speaking of power security, few royal crimes are as famous and as disputed as the two small figures who vanished into a tower. Crime 8. The Princes in the Tower. Edward Thieve and his brother Richard, Duke of York, were the sons of Edward V. In 1483, Edward V was supposed to become king. Instead, he was lodged in the Tower of London for safekeeping. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became Richard III. The boys were seen less and less. Then they were simply not seen. The accusation that Richard III murdered his nephews became one of the most enduring charges in English history. The evidence is not a modern forensic package. It's a web of later accounts, political propaganda from the Tudor era, and the uncomfortable fact that the boys disappeared while under the control of the regime that benefited from their absence. Others have argued alternative suspects. Henry VII is sometimes floated as having motive after taking the throne, but the key point is this: the disappearance itself is the crime, and the Crown's ability to control narrative is part of what made it possible. If you want the uncomfortable truth, it's this: when royal succession is at stake, children can become obstacles. Obstacles can be removed, and history, if written by the winners, can call the removal uncertain. Crime 9. Henry VII and the crushing of pretenders. Henry VII's claim to the throne after the Wars of the Roses was not unchallenged. That meant pretenders, real or manufactured, were existential threats. Lambert Simnel was presented as a Yorkist figurehead in 1487. Perkin Warbeck claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the missing princes. The state response to such challenges was often ruthless: imprisonment, execution, and the grinding down of supporters through forfeitures and intimidation. Warbeck was ultimately executed in 1499. That same year, Edward, Earl of Warwick, another potential Yorkist focal point, was executed after years in the Tower. Here the crime is less a single dramatic act and more the pattern: security through elimination. Tudor governance learned quickly that stability could be purchased by making examples. The machinery of treason, confessions, trials, proclamations functioned as both law and theatre. Yes, some of these men may have been political tools, but the punishment did not depend on truth so much as usefulness. A claimant didn't have to be genuine to be dangerous. He only had to be believed by enough people. And speaking of belief, few things were more useful to Tudor power than convincing the nation that dissent itself was a moral infection. Crime 10. Henry VIII and the assembly line of executions. Henry VIII, reigned 1509 to 1547, didn't invent political killing. He industrialized it. Through treason trials, acts of attainder, and the ever-flexible charge of imagining the king's death, Henry's government created a pipeline from suspicion to scaffold. Thomas More was executed in 1535 for refusing the oath of supremacy. Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536, accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges many historians view as politically engineered, though absolute certainty is impossible because the court record is entangled with fear and incentive. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of much of Henry's policy, was executed in 1540 when he became inconvenient. Catherine Howard followed, executed in 1542. The dark twist is the way law provided the costume for personal will. Parliament could be used as a blade. Courts could be tuned to a monarch's preferred outcome. Confessions could be coaxed, witnesses encouraged, evidence shaped, and the public had to watch. That was part of it. A royal execution wasn't just punishment, it was instruction, broadcast in blood, reminding everyone what the king could do with a signature. Crime 11. The Pilgrimage of Grace and Royal Retribution. In 1536, thousands in northern England rose in what became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, part protest, part rebellion, sparked by religious upheaval and economic anger. The rebels negotiated. They believed, briefly, that the king might compromise. Then the crown struck back. After the movement faltered, Henry VIII's government carried out a wave of executions. Leaders were hanged, drawn and quartered. Abbots were executed. People of status and people of no status alike were punished. The number of deaths is debated, but the pattern is documented. Promises of leniency followed by state violence once the threat had been contained. This is a recurring royal crime, the use of negotiation as a holding tactic and mercy as a temporary costume. Once a rebellion no longer had leverage, the state could revert to terror, again not hidden but made public, because fear was part of the lesson. And speaking of public lessons, England's religious whiplash under the Tudors produced another kind of crime, killing people not for what they did, but for what they believed. Crime 12. Mary I and the heresy burnings. Mary I, reigned 1553-1558, has been branded Bloody Mary for a reason rooted in policy, the persecution of Protestants through burnings for heresy. Roughly 280 Protestants were executed during her reign, many burned at the stake. The burnings were legal under revived heresy laws. That's the pivot. Legality does not cleanse cruelty. The state framed these deaths as spiritual correction. Victims experienced them as terror. Communities experienced them as warning. Mary's defenders argue the violence must be contextualized. Her father and half-brothers' regimes also used lethal force, and early modern Europe was soaked in religious persecution across borders. True, but the royal crime here is the crown's use of faith as a legal weapon, and the deliberate public staging of suffering. The twisted part is the intimacy of it. Neighbours watching neighbours burn, because a monarch and her advisors insisted unity required pain. And once you normalise that, it becomes easier to normalise other forms of state violence too, like the quiet theft of land. Crime 13. Elizabeth I and the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, was a dynastic problem wrapped in a human being. Catholic claimants and conspirators could rally around her as an alternative to Elizabeth I. She spent years in English custody. Plots bubbled around her name. In 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle after being implicated in the Babington plot. The court case relied on intercepted correspondence and the logic of preemptive security. Mary's supporters argued entrapment and manipulation. Elizabeth's government argued necessity. Elizabeth herself famously played a political game of reluctance, signing the warrant, then later acting as though the execution had happened against her softer wishes. That is the crime-like twist, plausible deniability as royal technique. You let the machinery of state do the killing, then you mourn the outcome you authorize. The record shows how carefully image was managed. Elizabeth needed Catholic Europe to fear her, but also needed domestic legitimacy that didn't look like casual regicide. And speaking of regicide, once you declare a monarch killable, you create a precedent that doesn't stay politely in its box. Crime 14. James the Wire favoritism and the overpriced monopoly state. Under James the Foreign, reigned 1603-1625. Corruption wasn't a scandal, it was often a system. The Crown's finances were strained, and one way to raise funds without Parliament was to sell monopolies and patents, exclusive rights that allowed favoured individuals to control certain trades or goods. These monopolies could inflate prices and crush competition. Parliament complained repeatedly, and public anger simmered. James's court also became notorious for favouritism, especially toward handsome young courtiers like George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, whose rapid rise fed suspicion of influence trading. Was this crime, in a prosecutable sense? Often it lived in the grey zone of power. legal permission to do what would look like bribery if anyone else did it, selling access, selling titles, selling economic privilege, then calling it governance. The twist is how it shifts the burden onto ordinary people. When prices rise because a monopoly holder wants profit, the royal gift becomes a hidden tax. And because it's packaged as law, outrage has nowhere clean to land. But the monarchy's relationship with wealth gets darker still when you zoom out, beyond England, into the empire building that made fortunes through forced labour. Crime 15, Royal Charters and the Business of Human Being. The British monarchy did not run the Atlantic slave trade alone, but royal authority helped legitimise and supercharge it. In the 17th century, royal charters supported companies that trafficked enslaved Africans, including the Royal African Company, which was closely associated with the Duke of York. Later, James II. The word royal wasn't decorative. It signalled endorsement, protection, and prestige. Enslaved people were treated as cargo. Profits flowed through merchants, investors, and the broader state economy. The crown benefited indirectly through taxation, imperial expansion, and the political strength that wealth brings. The crime here is not a single courtroom episode. It is the institutional blessing of a system that kidnapped, transported, and brutalized millions. Historical records document the scale of the trade. What's harder is tracing the moral accountability when the beneficiaries were spread across a whole ruling class. But the twisted part is the branding. Violence marketed as civilization, bondage recorded as commerce, suffering transformed into ledgers. When a crown lends legitimacy to that, the monarchy becomes part of a crime that lasted generations. And speaking of legitimacy, England eventually did something even more radical than licensing human trafficking. It executed a king. Crimes 16, Charles the Far, Civil War, and the state's right to kill a monarch. Charles the Thin, reigned 1625 to 1649, pushed the limits of royal authority, contentious taxation, religious policy, dissolution of parliament, and a belief in divine right monarchy that collided with a changing political reality. The result was civil war. In 1649, Charles was tried and executed for treason against his people, an extraordinary inversion of the usual logic, where the people were traitors to the king, not the other way around. Was this a crime? Legally, it was presented as justice by the regime that held power. Many contemporaries viewed it as murder dressed as law. Later Restoration propaganda treated it as martyrdom. The point for our list is the grim precedent. Once you build a political machine capable of killing a king, you've admitted that sovereignty can be forcibly transferred. That reality doesn't disappear when the monarchy returns. It lingers behind the throne like a draft under the door. And speaking of what lingers, the Restoration Court that followed Charles III's death didn't just restore a king. It restored a particular kind of decadent impunity. Crime 17, Charles II's court and the normalizations of predation. Charles II, reigned 1660–1685, returned to a monarchy eager to enjoy itself after years of upheaval. The Restoration Court became famous for mistresses, parties, and scandal. Behind the glitter, it also reveals a darker royal pattern, powerful men treating people, especially women, as disposable. Some of what survives is gossip. Some is documented in diaries and correspondence like Samuel Pepys's records of court culture. The difficulty is distinguishing consensual relationships, coercion, and outright assault in a period that did not treat women's consent as a priority. But that is precisely the point. An environment where consent is culturally irrelevant is a factory for abuse. Royal favourites and courtiers had influence, wealth, and access to institutions that could ruin reputations. Accusations could be buried as impropriety. Victims could be dismissed as liars or temptresses. The king's own romantic life was celebrated in ways that blurred into entitlement. The crime here is structural. Predation enabled by hierarchy, masked as glamour. And once the court normalizes it, the pattern can persist for centuries, changing costumes but keeping the same bones. Crime 18, James II and the politics of religious intimidation. James II, reigned 1685 to 1688, became king as a Catholic in a Protestant kingdom. His attempts to expand toleration for Catholics and dissenters were tangled with power plays that many feared were a step toward absolutism. The result was paranoia, resistance, and ultimately, the Glorious Revolution. In this environment, law became a weapon. Officials were pressured, institutions were reshaped, opponents were treated as threats not just to policy, but to the state's identity. Some prosecutions and crackdowns, while legal on paper, functioned as intimidation campaigns. It's tempting to simplify James II as a villain. The reality is messier. He genuinely believed in religious freedom, but he pursued it through methods that looked like coercion, and he ran headfirst into entrenched prejudice. The crime thread here is how quickly fear can turn governance into an excuse for oppressive measures. And speaking of fear, few royal scandals show how fear can be exploited like the next one, an alleged Catholic plot so vast it became an industry. Crime. 19. The Popish plot, panic, and state-sponsored lies. In 1678, Titus Oates fabricated what became known as the Popish plot, an alleged Catholic conspiracy to assassinate Charles II and overthrow Protestant England. The claims were false, but they spread like wildfire. The plot led to arrests, trials, and executions. Innocent people died because panic became policy. Parliament, courts, and public opinion were swept into hysteria. Oates's lies were rewarded, at least for a time, because they aligned with existing anti-Catholic fears. Contemporary records show how quickly evidence was manufactured by rumor, coerced testimony, and confirmation bias. Charles II himself was skeptical, but the machinery of state and the appetite of the public made skepticism politically dangerous. The monarchy's role here is complicated, not always as the primary driver, but as a key part of the system that allowed the lie to become lethal. The twist is that even when the crown doubts a narrative, it may still benefit from letting it run, because fear can be useful, and fear, once unleashed, is hard to put back on a leash. Crime 20. The Glorious Revolution's quiet violence. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 is often sold as a relatively bloodless transfer of power. James II replaced by William III and Mary II. Parliamentary supremacy strengthened. Protestant succession secured. But bloodless depends on where you stand. In Ireland, the revolution led to war. The Williamite conflict culminated in the Battle of the Boyne, 1690, and the brutal politics that followed, shaping centuries of sectarian division and penal laws. In Scotland, the upheaval helped set the stage for events like the Glencoe massacre in 1692, where a government entangled with royal authority failed spectacularly in morality. The royal crime here is not a single stabbing in a palace corridor. It's the way a constitutional fairy tale can erase the bodies that made the tale possible. William and Mary's regime benefited from violence carried out in the name of stability, while metropolitan England congratulated itself on moderation. And speaking of the violence that happens elsewhere, royal history becomes especially twisted when the crown's power stretches across oceans, where distance makes cruelty easier. Crime 21. The Massacre. At Glencoe and the signature that killed in February 1692, members of Clan MacDonald of Glencoe were attacked and killed by soldiers who had been lodged among them as guests. That detail, guests, never stops being sickening. The massacre grew out of a tense political landscape after the Glorious Revolution. Highland clans were required to swear loyalty to William III and Mary II. The MacDonalds were late. Whether the delay was bureaucratic confusion, weather, or quiet resistance, the government chose to make an example. Orders moved through chains of command, including signatures at the top. The crown itself wasn't on the ground with a musket, but the authority that enabled the killing flowed downward from the regime's need to prove control. Contemporary outrage focused on the betrayal, hospitality violated, people slain in their homes, a punishment that targeted a community rather than a battlefield. Official inquiries later recognized the atrocity in careful political language, condemnation without fully dismantling the system that produced it. The pivot is the paperwork. A massacre can begin as ink drying on an order, and once you realize that, you start seeing royal crime scenes not only in castles but in offices. And speaking of offices, few royal-linked crimes show bureaucratic cruelty as clearly as what happened in Ireland after conquest, where land itself became evidence. Crime 22. Plantations, land theft as policy. Across the 16th and 17th centuries, English and later British rule in Ireland expanded through conquest and colonisation. The plantation system involved confiscating Irish land and granting it to English and Scottish settlers, often with military backing and legal mechanisms designed to make dispossession look tidy. The Crown's role was central. Charters, grants, proclamations, and the legitimising aura of royal authority. Irish landowners could be declared rebels, titles could be invalidated, new surveys could redraw reality. The plantation was not a spontaneous migration. It was engineered with violence nearby and law in front, like a polite mask. This is a royal crime because it turns governance into organised theft. The evidence is extensive in state records, grants, maps, legal acts, and the demographic reshaping that followed. The consequences were generational: economic displacement, cultural suppression, and a deepening cycle of rebellion and repression. And speaking of repression, when rebellion did ignite, the state's response could be so brutal, it became legendary. Crime 23. Cromwell in Ireland and the Royal Shadow. Oliver Cromwell was not a monarch, but the monarchy's story cannot escape what his conquest of Ireland, beginning 1649, did to the archipelago's political landscape. It's part of the royal crime tradition because it shows what happens when the state's legitimacy fractures and violence becomes a language everyone speaks fluently. Massacres at places like Drogheda and Wexford were recorded and debated, with arguments over numbers, context, and intent. What is not debated is that the campaign involved severe punitive violence and led into policies of land confiscation that reshaped Ireland. Later monarchs inherited that landscape, and the Crown's restoration did not undo the dispossession. Instead, it often stabilized it. Here's the pivot. Even when a monarch is absent, the institution can still benefit from crimes committed in the name of order. The Restoration monarchy came back to a realm in which land had changed hands through force. The Crown didn't need to commit the theft if it could inherit the stolen goods. And speaking of inherited wealth, royal courts often carried a scent of corruption, where access could be bought and sold like meat at market. Crime 24. George V and the Foreign Court cash pipeline. When George V became king in 1714, he arrived from Hanover into a Britain that regarded him with curiosity, suspicion, and sometimes open hostility. Language barriers and distance from British political culture created an environment where intermediaries, favourites, ministers, courtiers became powerful. Accusations of bribery and influence peddling were common in early Georgian politics, not always because they were uniquely true under George I, but because the system was ripe for it. Offices could be treated like income streams. Patronage could look like a marketplace. The Crown's need for parliamentary support meant that support became negotiable in ways that blurred into corruption. This is one of those royal crimes that rarely ends with a dramatic execution. Instead, it produces cynicism. When people believe government is for sale, trust decays. And when trust decays, the state relies more on coercion, propaganda, and spectacle to hold itself together. And speaking of coercion, Britain's rulers found a particularly efficient tool: turning poverty into a crime. Crime 25. The Bloody Code. When the state made theft a hanging matter, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, English law became notorious for the sheer number of offences punishable by death, a framework often called the Bloody Code. Theft of surprisingly minor goods could, in theory, end at the gallows. Monarchs didn't draft every statute, But the crown was the head of a system that enforced these laws, benefited from the social order they promised, and used mercy as a discretionary performance. Pardons existed, but that discretion is itself a kind of power. You can terrify the poor with law, then show kindness when it suits you. The pivot is that this isn't a crime committed by a monarch as an individual. It's a crime committed by a class through a state. The criminalization of survival, the protection of property over life, and the transformation of desperation into spectacle. And speaking of spectacle, sometimes the crown didn't just punish crime, it made an example of an entire culture. Crime 26, the Highland clearances and the language of improvement. The Highland clearances were not a single event, but a long process, especially in the late 18th and 19th centuries, where many Highland tenants were evicted to make way for more profitable land uses, including sheep farming. The role of the monarchy is indirect, yet real. The Crown's legal order underpinned landlord power, and the ideology of improvement was celebrated at the highest levels of society. Evictions could involve burned homes, forced migrations, and communities shattered. Some people ended up in coastal crofting conditions, many emigrated. The violence varied by region and landlord, and the legal record often makes cruelty sound like procedure. Removals, relocations, consolidation. Is it fair to label this as a royal crime? The Crown was not personally conducting evictions, but the monarchy was the symbol and guarantor of a system that prioritized profit and elite land control. Royal ideology, order, hierarchy, property made it harder to challenge landlord authority. The twisted part is the moral laundering, suffering presented as progress. A cleared village could be called modernization, as if people were outdated furniture. And speaking of laundering, few institutions have laundered violence into legitimacy as smoothly as empire. Crime 27. Empire's legal violence. From India to the Caribbean, British monarchs were crowned as sovereigns not only of Britain, but of expanding imperial holdings. The crown's name, through proclamations, charters, and later ceremonial titles, was repeatedly used to legitimize extraction. In India, East India Company rule began as commerce and drifted into conquest. The company was not the monarchy, but it operated under royal charters and within a system that treated non-European lives as negotiable. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, company rule ended and the British state took direct control, eventually with Queen Victoria proclaimed Empress of India in 1876. The symbolism mattered. It wrapped political domination in regal dignity. The crime thread here is the gap between ceremony and reality. Protection could mean forced labor. Civilization could mean famine worsened by policy. Order could mean mass violence when subjects resisted. We know about these patterns from administrative records, contemporary reporting, and later historical analysis. Many details remain debated, especially numbers in famines and the exact responsibility of particular policies, but the broader structure is clear. Imperial violence was frequently bureaucratic, and the crown was the emblem stamped on top. And speaking of emblem, sometimes the crown's emblem was used to justify the theft of culture itself. Crime 28. The spoils of war. Royal collections and taken treasures. Royal collections contain remarkable art and artifacts. The uncomfortable question is how many entered the collection through conquest, coercion, or imperial imbalance. From looted objects in colonial campaigns to gifts obtained under unequal power, the line between acquired and taken can be thin as paper. Even when items were purchased, the context matters. A sale made under colonial pressure doesn't feel like free commerce. This topic can be contentious because specifics vary by object. Some have documented seizure histories, others are murkier. What isn't murky is the structural advantage. Empire made certain acquisitions possible. Royal patronage and prestige encouraged collecting. Displaying foreign treasures inside royal spaces transformed global inequality into aesthetic triumph. The pivot is the story told by the object, not just what it is, but what happened to get it there. When a crown displays the spoils of domination as beauty, it becomes a museum of power. And speaking of domination, let's turn back to bodies because royal crime narratives often return to one recurring pattern: suspicious deaths near the throne. Crime 29, the mysterious death of Prince Albert Victor, speculation warning. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was the eldest son of the future Edward VII and second in line to the throne behind his father. In 1892, he died of influenza during an epidemic. Officially. Around that death, rumours later proliferated. Conspiracies involving scandal, cover-ups, even claims tying him to infamous crimes in London. Most historians regard those theories as unsupported, and the strongest documentation points to illness. Still, the reason this belongs in a twisted crimes documentary is not because the conspiracy is credible, but because the monarchy's secrecy invites mythology. When an institution is habitually opaque, it creates an ecosystem where scandal can breed. And sometimes that ecosystem is deliberately cultivated. Secrecy can protect privacy, but it can also protect wrongdoing. In Albert Victor's case, the crime is not proven murder. It's the pattern of rumour feeding on royal silence. And speaking of silence, sometimes it's not rumour. Sometimes it's a documented scandal that the palace would rather you remember as a private matter. Crime 30, the Marlborough era, and the blurred line between war and profit. John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, was one of Britain's most successful generals during the War of the Spanish Succession. He wasn't a monarch, but his fortunes and influence were deeply tied to royal favour and state power. Accusations emerged about profiteering, kickbacks, and the use of public money. These allegations were politically weaponized and contested. Some were likely exaggerated by enemies, others had substance. Marlborough was at times dismissed and investigated. The larger point is how war can become a financial machine for elites, and royal courts can provide cover or complicity through patronage. This is another system crime, rather than a single murder. When the ruling class profits from conflict, and the crown legitimizes the class, accountability gets fuzzy. The people who bleed and the people who benefit are rarely the same. And speaking of who bleed, royal history's most twisted crimes often involve controlling women's bodies and reputations like state property. Crime 31, the criminalization of Queen Anne Boleyn's case file feel. Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536 remains one of the most chilling royal episodes because it reads like a prosecution built to achieve a predetermined result. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Several men were executed alongside her. The evidence as we can reconstruct it is deeply suspect. Timelines strained, confessions questionable, the political motive enormous. Henry VIII needed a new marriage and a male heir. Anne had become a problem. Suddenly, the machinery of state produced charges that justified her elimination. We cannot absolutely prove fabricated evidence in every detail. This is 16th century legal record territory, with gaps and propaganda, but the pattern is undeniable. Power wanted an outcome, and law delivered it. The twisted part is the calmness of it, not a battlefield. Not a riot, a courtroom performance and a clean execution. A queen transformed into a criminal so the king could sleep at night and look righteous in the morning. And speaking of righteous performances, the next crime shows how the crown used morality as a cudgel, then ignored morality when it became inconvenient. Crime 32, the royal mistress, economy and respectability. As blackmail from the Stuarts through the Georgians, royal mistresses were not just tabloid fodder, they were political nodes. They could receive money, titles, property and influence. Their families could rise, their enemies could be squeezed. The crime-like aspect emerges when morality is selectively enforced. A court could ruin a woman for a scandal while rewarding another woman for being scandalous in the right direction. Sexual reputation became leverage, and leverage became policy. This is hard to document in the way a murder is documented, but correspondence, memoirs, and political patterns show how private life was entangled with power. If you wanted something from the crown, or from someone close to it, social intimacy could function like a backdoor bribe. And speaking of bribery, Britain's monarchy has repeatedly been entangled with money in ways that blur legitimacy, including the selling of honours. Crime 33. Cash for honours and the price tag on prestige. The selling of honours, peerages, knighthoods, titles has erupted as scandal at multiple points in British history. One of the most notorious episodes was associated with David Lloyd George's era in the early 20th century, when allegations of cash for honours became a major political controversy. The monarchy's role is structural. Honours are conferred in the monarch's name, even when the political machine behind recommendations is governmental. The crown is the ceremonial face that makes the honour feel sacred. That means the crown also becomes the laundering mechanism when honours are traded for donations or political support. Investigations and reforms emerged over time, and the rules around honours have been tightened in various ways. Yet the pattern persists because titles are social power, and social power attracts commerce. The twisted part is how it devalues genuine service. When honours can be bought, they become less a recognition of merit and more a receipt. And speaking of receipts, royal finances themselves can become a crime story when the public cannot see where the money goes. Crime 34. Royal finances and the shadow of off-limits. Accounting. The British monarchy's funding has historically been a blend of private wealth, public grants, and complex arrangements over estates and revenues. Over centuries, the details have often been shielded by tradition, legal complexity, and the idea that certain matters are not for public discussion. The crime angle here isn't necessarily embezzlement, it's opacity as an enabling condition. When an institution cannot be easily scrutinized, small abuses can survive undetected, and larger injustices can be normalized because no one can clearly trace them. From royal household expenditures to the use of estates with historic origins in conquest and exploitation, the money story is often uncomfortable. Debates about accountability flare up periodically, precisely because the system invites distrust. And speaking of distrust, one of the monarchy's most infamous modern-adjacent controversies involves a king who couldn't stop chasing a woman, and a legitimacy problem the state tried to manage with paperwork. Crime 35. Edward VIII, divorce and a constitutional crisis. As damage control, Edward VIII's abdication in 1936 is commonly framed as a romantic scandal. A king gave up the throne for Wallis Simpson. The darker interpretation is that the state and crown engaged in intense image management to protect the monarchy's stability and to obscure other troubling concerns such as Edward's political sympathies and his suitability as a sovereign. This isn't a murder case. It's a cover-up culture case. What gets emphasized, what gets buried, what becomes the official narrative. Modern records and later scholarship suggest that there were serious worries about Edward's judgment and political leanings beyond his marital situation. The palace and government needed a neat story the public could swallow. The crime-like pivot is narrative fraud, using a simpler scandal to conceal a more structurally dangerous one. Even when not illegal, it's an abuse of public trust. And speaking of public trust, when the monarchy's image is threatened, it can become tempted to treat people's lives as disposable props. Crime 36. The royal problem of unwanted relatives. Institutional confinement. Over the 20th century, stories have emerged about members of royal or aristocratic circles being hidden away, particularly relatives with disabilities treated as embarrassing secrets rather than family members with rights and dignity. Some of these cases are documented, others are contested in detail. The broader pattern fits what many elite families did in eras when disability was stigmatized. Institutionalize, conceal, minimize. When this happens within the royal orbit, it carries extra moral weight, because the monarchy markets itself as a national family, while practicing private exclusion. The crime here is not always a prosecutable offence under the laws of the time. It's a moral crime, a life erased to protect a brand. And if the institution can erase its own relatives, it's not hard to imagine how it might erase inconvenient employees, witnesses, or victims. And speaking of victims, royal history is crowded with women whose bodies became battlegrounds for legitimacy, with consequences that can look like slow-motion homicide. Crime 37. Queen consorts and obstetric politics. As coercion for centuries, queens consort were expected to produce heirs under intense surveillance. The royal bedchamber could be crowded with witnesses at births to prevent substitution myths. Medical decisions were made under pressure. Personal autonomy was subordinated to dynasty. When childbirth was dangerous, and it often was, this pressure could become lethal. We can point to documented tragedies, women who died in childbirth or from postnatal complication, while the state watched like a creditor waiting for payment. The crime is not that childbirth is risky, it's that the institution treated the woman's body as state property and sometimes took risks with her life as acceptable collateral. The twisted part is the hypocrisy. The Crown celebrates motherhood as virtue, but historically treated mothers as instruments. In a modern context, we would call that coercion. And speaking of coercion, royal courts have also used forced marriages as policy tools, which can be a form of sanctioned captivity. Crime 38. Dynastic marriage. As control, the polite kidnapping. Royal marriages were often arranged for diplomacy. That sounds civilized until you remember what it meant for the individuals involved, especially young women married into foreign courts, far from home, with limited agency. A princess could be shipped across borders like a treaty clause, expected to adapt, produce heirs, and remain loyal to a family that selected her like a chess piece. Some did find power. Others found isolation, surveillance, and punishment if they resisted. This isn't a court case crime. It's a systemic violation of autonomy, normalized as statecraft, and its psychological cruelty is sharpened by the pageantry, smiling portraits, ceremonies, and poetry, covering what is essentially a life decided for you. And speaking of lives decided for others, let's return to the Empire, where royal authority was used to crush resistance with methods that would be described as atrocities if anyone else did them. Crime 39. Kenya's Mayu Mo crackdown and the Crown State. During the 1950s Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, British colonial forces and authorities carried out detentions, camps, and brutal counterinsurgency measures. Torture, abuse, and mass detention have been documented, and later legal cases and historical research have brought aspects of this violence into public view. The monarchy was not running the camps, but Kenya was a colony under the Crown, and the imperial state operated in the monarch's name. This matters because it reveals how the monarchy's symbolic role can shield accountability. Violence is done for the Crown, even as the Crown appears above politics. The pivot is the distance. Violence in colonies could be treated as regrettable necessity, while the metropole enjoyed ceremonies and speeches about dignity. That split between image and practice is one of the darkest through lines in modern royal history. And speaking of distance, sometimes the most twisted crimes aren't far away at all. Sometimes they're in a palace, hidden behind closed doors, dismissed as private, and protected by deference. Crime 40. Royal households and the culture of silence. Every large institution develops ways to protect itself. Royal households, with their hierarchies and traditions, are particularly prone to secrecy. Staff sign confidentiality agreements. Leaks are treated as betrayal. Reputation management becomes its own department. The crime-like danger here is obvious. When silence is prized above truth, wrongdoing can persist. Harassment, exploitation, or abuse can be minimized to avoid scandal. Complaints can be treated as disloyalty. Victims can be isolated because the institution's primary instinct is preservation. This is difficult to narrate with definitive historical evidence across centuries because the whole point of silence is that records disappear. Yet the recurring pattern across many royal and elite households, documented in various periods through diaries, memoirs, court cases, and journalism, is clear. Power prefers quiet. And speaking of quiet, sometimes quiet is all that's left after a scandal breaks. A story is managed and the people harmed are expected to vanish from public memory. Crime 41, the Warren Hastings era. Imperial governance as plunder, royal shadow. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of Bengal, was impeached in Britain in the late 18th century over accusations of corruption and misconduct during East India Company rule. The trial was massive, public, and dramatic, yet the underlying system of extraction continued. Again, this is not the king personally stealing. It's the monarchy as the pinnacle of a state that built wealth through empire. Hastings' case shows how accountability can be staged, a big moral theatre that reassures the public, while the broader machine keeps grinding. The pivot is selective prosecution. One administrator becomes the face of wrongdoing, and the empire itself remains respectable. The crown benefits from the empire's wealth and prestige, even when the empire's methods are condemned in principle. And speaking of condemnation, there are royal-linked scandals where the state seemed to condemn wrongdoing only when it became politically useful. Crime 42, the respectability of violence, punishment in the name of order. From the suppression of labour movements to harsh policing of protest, the British state has repeatedly used force in ways that later generations question. The monarchy's involvement is typically indirect, but symbolically present. The crown is the state's face, the figure on currency, the authority invoked in oaths. When the state cracks down violently, the monarch is often silent, presented as neutral. That neutrality can look like complicity to those on the receiving end. The crime-like element is the gap between the monarchy's public role as moral symbol and its practical function as shield for state power. This doesn't mean every monarch secretly approves every crackdown. It means the institution's design protects itself first. If the state commits abuses, the monarchy can float above it, smiling at ceremonies while people bleed below. And speaking of bleeding below, some royal crimes are literal. Deaths tied to monarchy-adjacent violence, where the line between accident and intent becomes a fog. Crime 43, hunting accidents and aristocratic impunity. In elite circles, hunting was not only sport, it was identity. It also produced a steady stream of injuries and deaths, sometimes involving firearms, horses, or dangerous terrain. Most were accidents, but most is a word that leaves room. When an accident happens among the powerful, accountability can be softer, investigations can be discreet, witnesses can be loyal. The public might never see details. This is not a single specific allegation pinned neatly to one monarch, but a recurring risk. Aristocratic culture can turn lethal events into private tragedies rather than public inquiries. The twisted part is the privilege. If a poor person dies due to negligence, the system demands explanations. If a powerful person's negligence kills, the system often offers condolences and a closed door. And speaking of closed doors, let's step into one of the most notorious closed-door zones. Royal associations with predators and the institutional temptation to treat scandal as a PR problem rather than a moral crisis. Crime 44. Royal associations with abusers and the problem of proximity. When a royal figure is connected, even socially, to someone later exposed as a serial abuser, the institution often responds defensively. Emphasize distance, minimize contact, focus on optics. The criminal wrongdoing belongs to the abuser. The royal crime is the enabling ecosystem. Proximity to power can protect predators, give them credibility, access, or the sense that consequences are negotiable. Even unintentional association can function as social armor. In such cases, the public often sees a familiar pattern. Statements crafted to reduce liability, accountability shaped like a press release, and the slow drip of information that suggests not transparency, but damage control. The pivot is trust. A monarchy relies on public trust. When it treats abuse allegations primarily as reputational threats, it erodes the very legitimacy it depends on. And speaking of legitimacy, royal legitimacy has often required rewriting events, editing narratives, and turning victims into footnotes. Crime 45. History written as evidence tampering. Not every royal crime requires a dagger. Sometimes it requires a chronicler. Across centuries, monarchs and their allies cultivated propaganda. Flattering portraits, official histories, censored pamphlets, controlled access to court, and the selective destruction or withholding of documents. We know this because the documentary record itself shows patterns of omission and revision. What gets preserved, what disappears, what is sealed. The crime analogy is evidence tampering. If you control the archive, you control the trial, because history is the trial of the dead, and the verdict shapes the living. This is why so many royal scandals remain uncertain. Uncertainty can be manufactured, and speaking of manufactured uncertainty, one of the most twisted tools is the forced confession, because it gives the state a story it can quote forever. Crime 46. Forced confessions and treason theatre. Treason trials in royal history often relied on confessions obtained under pressure, sometimes physical torture, sometimes the softer torture of imprisonment, threats, and despair. England's use of torture was officially constrained compared to some European states, but it did occur, especially in cases deemed threats to security. When a confession is extracted, the state gets what it wants: a neat narrative, a justification, a warning. The person who confesses, guilty or not, becomes a prop in the monarchy's performance of righteousness. The twisted part is that once a confession exists, it becomes evidence for centuries, even when the conditions of its creation were coercive. The crown doesn't only punish the person, it punishes truth itself because it replaces messy reality with a script. And speaking of script, royal history is full of staged morality plays. But one of the darkest plays is the idea that certain people are naturally criminal and the state is simply restoring order by breaking them. Crime 47. Criminalizing identity, from religious minorities to class. The monarchy sits atop an order that historically treated some identities as suspicious by default. Catholics in certain eras, dissenters, Irish populations under conquest, poor people under vagrancy laws and later colonial subjects. The state criminalized existence through laws that made being out of place an offense. Vagrancy laws, penal laws, passed like restrictions in colonies. These tools allowed the Crown's governments to police populations preemptively. The crime here is ideological, turning identity into probable guilt. It's also deeply practical. It makes control cheaper. You don't have to prove someone did wrong if the law presumes their category is wrong. And speaking of cheap control, there's a particularly modern flavor of royal crime story that involves surveillance, private information, and the power to shape public perception through media relationships. Crime 48. The monarchy, the press, and information as a weapon. The relationship between the monarchy and the press has long been mutually exploitative. In some eras, the press protected the royals, agreeing to avoid certain stories. In other eras, it pursued them aggressively. Behind the scenes, information could be traded, access for compliance, leaks for leverage, narratives shaped through selective briefings. The crime-like element is manipulation. When an institution that claims to represent national unity uses media dynamics to punish internal dissent or protect wrongdoing, it behaves like a political machine, just with better hats. We know this pattern through decades of reporting, memoirs, and the observable choreography of public narratives, stories that appear, vanish, reappear as exclusive insights, and always seem to land where they serve someone's interests. And speaking of interests, royal interests often collide with legal accountability in one recurring way: the special status that makes certain people feel untouchable. Crime 49. Above the law. Culture, and the dangers of deference. The monarchy in a constitutional system is not supposed to govern, but its members still move through society with extraordinary deference. Police, politicians, and institutions can become reluctant to treat royals like ordinary citizens, even when serious allegations arise. This doesn't mean every allegation is true. It means that the very conditions for truth-seeking can be compromised. If people are afraid of consequences, they may stay silent. If institutions fear scandal, they may hesitate. If the public is trained to see royals as inherently respectable, victims may be doubted by default. The twisted part is that respect becomes a protective barrier, like armor, and when armor exists, some people will test how far it goes. And speaking of how far it goes, our last crime returns to the oldest royal pattern of all: power protecting itself by disappearing problems, whether those problems are people, documents, or entire truths. Crime 50, the perfect royal crime, making the record go dark across this entire list. The most consistently twisted crime isn't any one act, it's the technique. Control the narrative, control the archive, control the witness, control the frame. A suspicious death becomes a fever, a dispossession becomes an improvement, a massacre becomes a regrettable incident, a stolen object becomes a gift, a coercive marriage becomes a duty, a crackdown becomes order, a lie becomes national security. And when you can do that, you can commit violence without always needing blood on the carpet. You can commit harm through procedure. You can make suffering look normal. You can even make it look noble. That's why royal history can feel like a hall of mirrors, the same acts refracted into different stories depending on who holds the candle. And now, after 50 twisted cases and patterns, we need to step back and ask the only question that matters. What does all of this do to the idea of the crown? If you listen carefully, you probably noticed something unsettling. The most royal part of these crimes isn't the jewel-studded villainy people imagine. It's the way power behaves when it expects to endure. When a monarchy is stable, it can commit harm slowly. It can build systems where violence is carried out by deputies justified by law and softened by ceremony. It can let officials do the cutting, then appear in public as a symbol of unity, as if unity were a natural condition rather than something maintained. Sometimes through fear, and when the monarchy is threatened, the harm can become sharper. Succession crises invite disappearances. Religious conflict invites executions. Imperial rebellion invites camps. Scandal invites silence. In each era, the costume changes. Mail and swords become paperwork and press offices, but the instinct remains. Protect the institution, protect legitimacy, protect the story. The most uncomfortable truth might be that the crown doesn't need to be evil to be dangerous. It only needs to be unaccountable. It only needs the benefit of doubt. It only needs enough people to believe the pageantry is the same thing as virtue. So if you're drifting off to sleep now, let the last thought be this: history isn't only what happened. It's what was recorded, what was preserved, and what was allowed to be forgotten. Royal history, more than most, teaches you to look for the missing pages, because sometimes the missing page is where the crime is. And if you want more long, calm, deep dives like this, more uncomfortable truths, more hidden histories, subscribe and join me for the next one.